Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel of series of public programs. This is part of our In Discussion series. This is also part of ICA's Curator's Perspective. It's great to have Jacopo Crivelli Visconti here. This program is organized, as I just mentioned, in collaboration with Independent Curators International. My name is Jaime Iglesias Luquin. I am the Director and Chief Curator of America Society. I want to let everyone know that this program, as you can see, is being recorded to be uploaded in our website after for future viewing, so please share it with friends and colleagues. I want to thank ICI, Renaud, and the whole team for choosing our space for this amazing presentation, an important one. And also, I want to thank Luisa in our team and Diana Flato for all their support, and Jonathan. I also want to remind everybody that after the panel, you can see the exhibition downstairs, Feliciano Centurion Abrigo, curated by Gabriel Perez Barreiro. That's going to be open until 6 p.m. And also that we have a very active public program series. And you can check our website for information on the other programs that we will have. And now I'll leave you with Renaud.
Thank you, Jaime. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome you here at America Society. Also, a great pleasure to see such a full room. Thank you for an amazing turnout. My name is Renaud Proche. I'm the Director of Independent Curators International, or ICI for short. And it's, again, my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. Jaime, thank you so much for having us here at America Society. I think it's very meaningful to be able to collaborate with you on this presentation. ICI is an organization that works with curators to support their work. Curators are at the center of a very intricate art ecosystem. They're the people who champion artistic practice, who support artists and connect them and their ideas to a wider public. So ICI has since 1975 produced traveling exhibitions, professional development programs, and public events such as this one, always in collaboration with other partners in the field, and today with America Society. So thank you, Jaime, for having us again. I also want to give a couple of other thank yous before we begin, if you allow me. I'd like to recognize the City of New York and the James Howell Foundation for their support of ICI's Curator's Perspective. And also, of course, thanking the São Paulo Bienal for their support and partnership in this particular event. I also would like to extend a big thank you to ICI trustee Serena Tang. Thank you, Serena. You're a member of the International Advisory Board of the São Paulo Bienal, and as a member of ICI's board, you've also helped us spearhead this event, so I want to thank you for that. The Curator's Perspective, for those of you who are new to it, is an itinerant talk series. So we partner with various art centers and arts organizations around town to present the perspectives of curators from around the world, from whom we learn their ways of seeing, their ways of looking, their ways of considering artistic practices, and of understanding the world of art in which we live. Today, we are thrilled to have Jacopo Visconti as the speaker of this Curator's Perspective. Jacopo is, of course, the curator of the upcoming São Paulo Bienal, and that opens in September, although it's already sort of underway, as we're about to hear. As an independent critic and curator originally from Italy, Jacopo has been based in São Paulo for, I think, almost 20 years, and in fact was involved with the São Paulo Bienal from 2001 to 2009. So this appointment is in some ways a return home, I should imagine. He curated the Brazilian Pavilion at the 2015 Venice Biennale, which featured the work of José Damasceno, some of you may remember, and also curated the Cuenca Biennial in 2014 in Cuenca, Ecuador. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome Jacopo today and to learn more about his plans, his research, his ideas for the São Paulo Bienal. And so without further ado, please help me welcome Jacopo Visconti.
Hello, good afternoon. It's really a big pleasure to be here. I thank you all for being here. Thank you to ICI, to America Society, to Sarina Tang, of course, for her invitation and her welcoming attitude always. I know Sarina for a long time. We've been together in China, now we're here, so we go back a long way. And as Renaud said, the idea here is to make an introduction to the project that we're working on for the 34th Biennial. I say we because I am the chief curator, but it's a very horizontal process with the rest of the team that you can see here. So Paulo Miada, who is the adjunct curator, who's Brazilian, born and raised in São Paulo and based in São Paulo. And then 3 guest curators, Carla Zaccagnini, who is actually an artist more than a curator, and we wanted to have somebody from a slightly different perspective to look at things. That was very important. She's Argentinian, but she was raised in Brazil and she now lives in Sweden. Ruth Esteves, who's from Spain, but has been living or lived for a long time in Los Angeles. She was the director of Red Cat, and now she's based in Mexico. And Francesco Stocchi, who's also Italian like me, but lives in Holland. And I mention all these different places where most of us were born and live as different, also in different part of the oceans, if you want, because I think this brings or gave all of us a specific perspective that we somehow bring to the exhibition. I think this is something that will hopefully become clearer when I explain a little bit more of this. And then we also have as a guest editor Elvira Dianganiose, who is born or son of Equatorial Guinean parents, who were raised in Spain and now lives in London. And I mentioned here that she's guest editor and also she's credited as director of the showroom, because one of the main ideas of this biennial is that it's the result of a series of collaboration. You will see that many of these collaborations, or most of these collaborations, are with Brazilian institutions, but there are also a lot or a growing series of international collaborations that we established in the Biennale, and they are in some cases a collaboration in the making or production or conceiving on an exhibition, and in other cases like Elvira's participation could be a reflection on what the catalog and the publications should be, because I will go several times, let's say, I will talk of the fact of how we want to have a real polyphony of visions in this project. So several people looking at the same things in different ways and presenting them in different ways. And so we thought that then to have, let's say, a conventional publication which just reflected our own vision would be a little bit too little or too narrowing. So we invited Elvira, so to say, to look at the exhibition that we're doing and to think together with us of the publication that we can do. So the first thing that I want to say about this project is, well, before starting actually, I hope the ideas that make up this project will become clear through the presentation. Like I always say, it's a project that it's quite difficult to begin to start to talk about, because there is a lot of different layers that are actually treated at the same time, more or less in coherent ways by us. And it's quite difficult to start talking about it, because there is an institutional level, a curatorial level, artistic. There is an idea of different audiences that get in touch in the biennial. So the starting point, let's say, for us in this project is really the city of São Paulo and the audience that goes to the Biennale. Here you see the park, the Ibirapuera Park, where the São Paulo Biennial building is placed. The building is this very long rectangular shape on the front side, and around it, this is a photo from the 50s, so you can imagine how the city expanded, but around it in all directions the city expands. And one aspect of this that is essential for us is that, as you might know, the São Paulo Biennial receives a huge audience. So in the last editions it was about between 900,000 and 1 million visitors, so it's really huge. But what is even more significant, I think, is that beyond being a huge number, it's a very, very, very diverse audience. So different from most contemporary art exhibitions that we visit or that we see, or for most contemporary art institutions, let's say, the kind of audience that goes to the biennial is very diversified. There is a lot of students. There is also, of course, an audience which is a specialized audience interested in contemporary art issues, maybe in curatorial issues, and on the more cutting edge, let's say, production. But there is also a huge amount of people who visit the biennial because it is, let's say, a cultural event in the broader sense, not specifically a contemporary art event. And this consideration was, for us, the starting point to think of the project as, in a way, a gesture or an attempt to do an exhibition that could talk to all these different audiences by, of course, presenting just one exhibition, but that can be read in several different ways. So the way we try to do this is by, to begin, let's say, also in the sense of chronologically how things are started, by beginning at the very beginning of the year and not in September, which is the usual date of the opening of the São Paulo Biennial. And here you can see this is the ramp that gives the outside ramp that gives access to the third floor of the Biennale, where right now there is already one exhibition in place. So as you can see here, we have a series of exhibitions and performances that already started. It started February 8th, and until the big opening of the large group show in September, these events will follow one another. And so we have three individual solo show that happen in different parts of the building. The first one by Jimena Garrido Leca, who's a Peruvian artist, is on right now on the third floor of the building. Then on the second floor, in April, we open an exhibition by Clara Yanni, who's a Brazilian artist. And then on the first floor, in July, we open an exhibition by Dina Lawson, who is a US photographer. And coinciding with each of these openings, there is also a very large performance. So the first one was Neo Muyanga, who is a musician from South Africa, and it was a very large performance that he did that took actually the part of the building where the three floors are connected. So it was like a very celebratory moment, let's say, of the start of the Biennale. Then the second performance will be The Words of Others by Leon Ferrari, which is a piece that was realized for the first time a few years ago, so after Leon's death, and it's a very long piece. It takes almost 8 hours, and it will take place in the auditorium of the Biennale. And then the last one will be a premiere. It's a project of a performance or happening that Elio Tisica did and was never realized during his life. And this will be realized for the first time in this biennial. And the main idea of expanding the biennial and making it last the whole year is that when you go to these solo shows specifically, also the performance, of course, but in the solo show, this is probably more evident. Some of the ideas of the exhibitions are already laid out and are already presented. And especially the works that you encounter in these solo shows, you will encounter them again in the main large group exhibition. So the first time you get in touch with them, it's in the context of a solo show where, let's say, you think you understand the poetics of an artist, you go deep into his or her, well, actually just her in this case, because it's all women, in her way of thinking and looking at art. And then a few weeks later or a few months later, you encounter the same works again, but then in the context of a group show, so arranged thematically, and you're led as an audience to do a different reading of that. Or, as I was saying before, if you're a different kind of audience, one that is not so into the contemporary art discourse or the curatorial issues, maybe you encounter them for the first time, but then you don't encounter them as a solo show, but as a group show where maybe they are in relation with works by artists from other times, from other places, so you do a different reading of it. And this idea of doing different readings and being led as an audience or being invited to do this exercise of understanding what the curators are proposing, but not imposing, I will explain that a little better later, also happens at the time of the main exhibition. So when the main exhibition starts in the pavilion, September 5th, all these yellow dots that you see here are exhibitions that will be already in place in the city, because we're collaborating with about 25 institutions in town, and each of them will have a solo exhibition of an artist who also has works in the biennial. So again, as an audience, you were invited to do the exercise of reading the works by these artists in different ways, encountering them not only, let's say, as what happens in the Biennale, the same work in different moments, once as a solo show and once as a group show, but also in very different parts of the city, in very different institutions, and with very different connections, if you want. This is for us very important because, again, this goes back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, that one of the main reasons for proposing this project is to try to address the diversity of the audience that comes to the biennial. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the São Paulo scene, but there are here institutions that are, you could say, mainstream, like the Modern Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Museum, the Museum of Art in São Paulo. These are venues that are used to work with contemporary artists and that are used to do very often their most important show to coincide with the biennial. But then there is also more institutional places like the Instituto Moreira Salles or Banco do Brasil, so places that are private and somehow they're also important agents of the system because they do usually shows that maybe those other institutions don't have funds to do. And then you have other places that are completely not-for-profit, very often struggling with their own program to make it happen, like Casa do Povo, Pivot. These are places that are very important in the contemporary art scene, but they have a completely different approach, let's say, to their own program and to what kind of art they show. And then there is also a large number of institutions that you wouldn't even consider as part of the contemporary art scene, but they are very important cultural center in the context where they're situated. Like, for instance, the example that I always like to give is the Centro de Formação Cultural Cidade de Tiradentes, which you see at the far right here. This is actually not a dot, but an arrow, because the place is way more far away. It takes more or less 2 hours to get by car from the Biennale to this cultural center, and this is an essential place for this local community, which is part of São Paulo, but is also a community of about 200,000 people, which grew up extremely quick in the last 2 decades, more or less. And of course, for them, the relation with the Biennale is completely different than the relation that the Modern Art Museum could have, which is a museum that does contemporary art and which is really crossing the street from the Biennale. So the effort that we're doing is to try to find with each of those institutions, and especially with each of the very different audiences of those institutions, artists that make sense, let's say, for both of us, for the Biennale and for these institutions that are so diverse. And so in a way, we're trying to do a biennial that can reflect, again, the diversity of the audience that goes to visit the biennial. And each of those exhibitions that are parallel, but they are also an integral part of the Biennale, are not curated by us. This is something that is very important. So in the goal that we have to really create a polyphony of vision and to have different people looking at the same works or at the same artists in different ways, we try to establish also a network of different readings of those works. So in some cases, these are exhibitions curated by the curator of each institutions, and in other cases, there are guest curators coming to curate them, but it's never something that the curatorial team of the Biennale organizes. And now I wanted to bring some references that are very important for us. These are references that will not, let's say, be too emphasized in the exhibition itself, but they were very helpful for us in the building of the concept, basically, of the exhibition. So the first one is Edouard Glissant, who is a poet and a thinker from Martinique. I'm sure you're all familiar with him. He was a reference for us because of this idea of the poetics of relation, which is one of his main topics, and which obviously is very essential for us in the sense that Glissant defends that the meaning of what you do, what you are, is very much a result of the relations that are created between you or between each agent and whatever surrounds him, her, or it. And so this idea of giving different interpretations of what you see depending on whatever is surrounding it is for us central. But Glissant also talks in Poetics of Relations and in other books about opacity, which is another concept that for us is very important. Which is, in a way, the idea that you have to accept and understand the diversity of whoever you get in touch with, and respect the fact that you probably will not be able to fully understand what this other is. This idea of respecting the diversity and understanding that people are not exactly the same is one approach that we as curators of this biennial and as people who live in the times that we live in, we think is a very essential notion. The idea that you don't have to fully understand the other, you don't have to fully agree with the other to be able to go on and create these relations that Glissant talks about. And another reference that it's very important for us, and that to some extent, even though from a completely different point of departure, defends or talks about a similar approach, is Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is a Brazilian anthropologist. I know he's quite well known also here. And one of the things that for me is essential about Viveiros de Castro is that in more than one moment in his writings, he's very clear on how everything that he talks about, which is of course very well research from an anthropological point of view, is also philosophy, is also a way of approaching the world that we live in. So in that sense, he's a very fertile reference to be used in the building of an exhibition like the one that we're doing, because you sort of feel authorized to bring his concept into an art exhibition and to use these ideas in a different perspective. So the main idea that we like to constantly refer to is the idea of perspectivism, that you might know, the idea that everything is, again, the reading that you do of everything is influenced from the place from where you're looking at those things. So the perspective from where you're looking at things is what makes you understand things in a different way. And then in an exhibition where this perspective is constantly shifted throughout the year or throughout your understanding of an artwork, maybe going from the Biennale to one of those other parallel venues, this idea is a very important one for us. And then, since we have all these different references, and as I said, we have this idea of a polyphony of visions, we didn't want to work with a theme. So this is maybe another one of the ways that we're proposing to do this biennial in a slightly different way than most group shows, I would say, are done. We didn't start with a theme. We started actually from the artist. So all of us, the curators, we had several meetings in Brazil and in other places, and we brought to the table artists, or very often artworks specifically, that we thought were important, that were relevant for the time we live in Brazil, again, and elsewhere. And then from those artists, from those artworks, we slowly got to a core, let's say, and from that core, very slowly, by adding things and taking things out, some themes emerged. And these themes, so not a unique theme that informs the whole biennial, but these ideas, these topics, will be the ones that the audience will then understand or recognize in the exhibition. And since this process is such a long and very open process, we also didn't want to impose, let's say, these themes on the artworks and on the audience. So the way we're going to introduce these themes and work with them in the exhibition is also something that I wanted to introduce here, because I think it's something that will, to some extent, define the way the Biennale is read and understood. So what we came up with is what we're calling statements. These statements can be, let's say, objects or images or writings. It could be an excerpt from a movie. It could be a song. It's very diverse, but it's always objects, let's say, or things that have a very strong history, a very meaningful one. And then our text, instead of the conventional wall text that explains, let's say, how you have to read an exhibition, how you have to understand those works, our text will always talk about those objects or those statements instead of talking about the works. And then from this relation between something physical with a very strong history and something, a reflection or a story that you count about that, you will create a tone that sort of will make the audience read whatever surrounds that in a specific way. And I'll give you a couple of examples to make it a little bit clear. The first one is this bell is a bell that was casted in Germany in the 18th century and then was brought to Brazil. And in the end, toward the end of the 18th century in Brazil, the independence movement were starting. And one of the most famous took place in Minas Gerais, in the interior part of Brazil. And one of the symbol or the person who became the most important icon of this attempt, which was a failed attempt to independence, was called Tiradentes. And Tiradentes was taken by the Portuguese Empire and put to death on April 21st, 1792. And on that day, because an enemy of the state was being sentenced, no bell were allowed to ring. And this bell, apparently, the story goes, was rang as an homage to Tiradentes on that night. So then Brazil became independent. It became an independent state, a democracy. And in 1960, when Brasilia was inaugurated, this bell was actually brought to Brasilia and sang again. Now this time as a homage to a national hero, Tiradentes, to a national symbol, Brasilia, that was being created. So the idea is to bring this bell, if we're able, to the Biennale, and then around it, we would gather works that talk about these ideas of repetition and of how much things change in time. You can look at the same things, but given the context around it changing, you see them in different ways. And we will also gather some works that have been in previous editions of the Biennale, like in the 60s, in the 80s, in the 2000s. So you look at all these things again, you understand how the Biennale itself is part of the history of Brazil, and you're led to understand that different readings are possible, and it's repetition of objects and histories and artworks is very meaningful and needs to be understood. And this is, of course, a very important statement, I believe, to be done in the current time that we live in Brazil, where some crucial part of recent history are being denied by the government and by other figures in the Brazilian scene. So defending the necessity of looking back to history and understanding how these processes happen in a way is very important. Another example of a statement that we want to have is Frederick Douglass, who is, I'm sure, very familiar to all of you. What maybe you're not so familiar with is the fact that he was the most photographed man in the US in the 19th century, even more than Abraham Lincoln or than any other man. And this is very much because he was very aware of the importance that images already at that time had. Also, he wrote extensively on photography and on the importance, let's say, on how photography was a democratic revolution in the sense that normal people, let's say, would be able to have images in their houses as just kings would have before. So what we will do, we will have, again, if we're able, but in this case, I think we're going to make it, we're going to have a huge wall with all the photos that were taken of him. So it's about 150 photos that were taken of him during his life. And then our text, again, will not just tell his story, but it will address this idea of the circulation of images. More than talking about his figure or his importance in the fight against slavery, it will address this idea of circulation, which is, of course, in the case of somebody like Frederick Douglass, becomes circulation of images, but also of bodies treated as commodities at that time. So it addresses a lot of issues that then the works around it will also address, but from different perspectives and from different points of view. And the last one that I wanted to show you is actually not one of those statements that will be in the exhibition as a whole, but it's the title of the exhibition that for us works a little bit like a statement, in the sense that, as I said, we don't have one theme, but we have this title that sort of make the whole exhibition resonate in a specific way. The title in Portuguese is Faz escuro mas eu canto, which we translated to English as Though It's Dark, Still I Sing. And it's a verse by Tiago de Mello, who is a poet from the north of Brazil, from Amazonia, from the region of the Amazon. And it's, of course, a verse that very directly alludes to the times we live in, these times of darkness and of tragedy, if you want. But it also defends that in this time, there must be a space for singing and for talking about other things. There is another very famous verse by Brecht, which goes in English more or less like this. It says, "In the dark times, will there be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times." I think there is a slight but very profound difference between these two verses. And I personally like Tiago de Mello's more. I like the idea that even in the dark times, there must be room to sing about other things and not just about those dark times that we live in. So this image that I brought was a moment that for us, let's say, especially for those of us who live in São Paulo, the other curators were not there this day, but for us was very strong, because this is a picture of São Paulo around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This was the day when the wind brought all the ashes from the burning Amazon to São Paulo, and it became really night in the middle of the day. So this idea of a darkness we live in became suddenly very physical, and it sort of made you look at everything in a different way. And so this is more or less the idea that we have with the theme, the way we're working with the title, in the exhibition. It sort of makes everything resonate. It makes you read everything in a specific way. And then the last few images that I have, I wanted to talk a little bit about the architecture of the show. Well, a little bit of background. Like Renaud said, I worked at the Biennial for almost 8 years, almost 10 years ago. Then I left. I had a career as an independent curator, and now I'm back. But I know the building very well, and especially I've been involved in the process of several biennials. And one thing that is very specific to this building, as you can see in the upper part of the image, is in theory a very typical modernist free space, open space. You don't have walls dividing the exhibition floor, it's just columns, and you have the two large facades are glass, and you basically have two very small walls on each side. And this leads very often the curators and the architects to work with the space as if it were a neutral space. So very often what happens is that the works are defined before the architecture, but then the space in fact is not so neutral. So the building, which is an amazing building, sort of becomes your enemy in a way. And so for this time, what we did, we invited 3 architecture practices to propose ways of dealing with the building, let's say, before knowing what the works would be. And the winning project, which is by Andrade Moretin, a practice from São Paulo, actually, took this monumental or urban scale, if you want, of the building as a starting point. So on the lower part of the image, what you see is on the same scale of the building, a floor plan of the part of the city where they are. So you can see that the building is more than 2 normal blocks of the city. It's really huge. So based on that, what they proposed, this is a very preliminary sketch, so it's not the way it's going to be, but what they proposed is to create in the building these sort of galleries or pavilions, which is what they call an intermediary scale between the urban scale of the building and the scale that you really want to have for most of the works in the exhibition that need a much more intimate space. And this is for us a way that they proposed to deal with the architecture that also made a lot of sense from one specific perspective of the exhibition that maybe was not clear until now, but that is very key, I would say, to the understanding of the exhibition, which is that the scale of the project, as you probably understood, is very big. Like, we're expanding it throughout the whole year and in the whole city and collaborating with a lot of institutions. But on the other hand, the scale of the exhibition itself is probably much smaller than most biennials that we see, in the sense that we will not have many large-scale works, we will not have many commissioned works, because we're making an effort of, again, creating new relations maybe for works that you've seen before, or even, either in the process of the Biennale itself or because you've seen there somewhere else. But then we want to be able as curators to create very specific relations between the works and put really one work in relation with the other in a very specific way. So very often these works, as I said, are not new and especially are not large in scale. So this kind of intimate space that they're creating, it was very important for what we're trying to do. So in the end, when you go through the exhibition, you will encounter these different spaces and you will go from one to the other, which is also a way of creating a different rhythm and creating some poses, which in the scale of the building, again, is something that is very important. And here I wanted to show you an image of the first exhibition that we have, both to show the works, but especially you can see this wooden structure that is closing the space. This is one of those skins, let's say, that the architects propose. So in this case, it's the wooden structure that you see will always be like this, but we'll use different materials to close the different spaces. So this one is like a plexiglass where light comes through, but it's opaque in a way. Then there will be another which is more transparent, and another which is completely opaque and also allows to create some climate control areas for museum works and places that really needs that. So it's a way of creating a rhythm also in the architecture that will somehow allow to have also different ways of installing the works in the exhibition. And then one thing that is interesting to note here is that behind that wall that you see, which is one of the works by Jimena Garrido Leca, there is actually a quite large space which is empty. So the first exhibition is occupying one of those galleries, but not entirely. And this idea of not occupying entirely is not by accident. It's a way of pointing toward what is coming next. So like, it's not a space that is a leftover, but on the other hand, on the contrary, is a space that it's a space in potential and it's already awaiting, let's say, to be filled with whatever will come after it. And the last aspect, let's say, of the project is the publications. I already talked a little bit about that at the beginning. One of the things that we're doing is we started already a couple of weeks ago, no, maybe a little bit more, a month ago. More or less every 15, 20 days, we're sending from the Biennale what we're calling letters, correspondences that are from us, from the curators. They're not really talking about the exhibition. They're not really talking about the way we're building the exhibition. They can be more or less, let's say, linked to to whatever is happening around us or to things that we're thinking about. But slowly, from February until September, when we open the exhibition, if you read these letters, you somehow get, again, just like the exhibitions or the performances, point at some of the issues that we're thinking about. Also, these letters sort of create an atmosphere or a rhythm for what you will then encounter in the biennial. So again, the themes are never really imposed, or we're never really saying that this is the way things are or things should be read, but somehow we're trying from several different points, let's say, to open the process that we're doing, like if it's an open rehearsal in a way, that when you can go and see people or an orchestra maybe trying to get to this kind of fine tuning that an exhibition is about. And slowly these things sort of add one on top of the other, a layer, just like this presentation, which is one on top of the other, adding different layers. And eventually when people get to the biennial, it's not like they will really have the keys to see the exhibition, but they will have a lot of tools maybe or ideas that we've shared with them throughout the year. So this is my last show. It's a little bit of a joke in a way, how when we get back to where we started, maybe you can see it in a different way slightly. And it's also a way to talk about the graphic design. As you can see, there is the title, Though It's Dark Still I Sing. And then on the left and underneath is, you can maybe read Faz Escuro Mas Eu Canto, which is the title in Portuguese. But this title is fragmented. It's pierced through. You can see the color. You can see artworks underneath it. So in a way, it's a way of pointing at this idea of a biennial that is constructed by this multiple layer that goes on top of it, on top of each other throughout the year, and embracing the whole city at the time of the biennial. So this is more or less what I had to say. I hope now we can have a discussion on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacopo. I don't know if this is on. Yes, it's on. Great. Thank you so much for this presentation. So the idea is I just have a few questions for Jacopo, and we can start a conversation, but I will quite soon turn the questions over to you. So if you have some thoughts, make sure that they're ready. I love the idea. I kind of want to, since you've brought us from the beginning to the end, and we're seemingly at the same slide, so at the same space.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe start this conversation by talking a little bit about that idea of the letter and the way that you're thinking of building the catalog as this kind of series of letters that progressively bring you as the viewer towards the exhibition. And I was reminded of Rax Media Collective, and who's a collective of artists from India, many of you I'm sure are familiar with. Shuda Sengupta, who is one of the three of the collective, was describing the role of the curator as one that writes a love letter, a letter to some, almost like a Don Quixote love letter, a letter to someone that you imagine, but you not quite know who that is, because as curators, we actually never know who the audience is. And so I love this idea of the letter to someone else. I wonder if that's an idea that also resonates to you.
Well, it totally resonates. I didn't remember about it when we started. It's also very interesting, the process that we're having with the curators. So I really don't know who came up with this idea, how it came out. But for us, it's totally like you said, like you write it and you just let it go. But this is something that happens before the exhibition, during the exhibition, after the exhibition. No, we very often hear about exhibitions that we haven't seen, and they've become something else in the meantime. And for us, it was more of a way of also, to some extent, address the fact that it's 5 of us doing the exhibition, and we do agree on some things, but we also don't agree on other things. And I think it's very important for these letters, the fact that they're all signed by each of us. So in a way, it's addressing the fact that we're signing the biennial together as curators, but we also have each of us his or her own identity and vision on things. This is very much related to what I was saying before about Glissant, about diversity, about being in relation one with the other. So beyond let's say what each letter says, the series of letters as a whole, probably with the diversity of tones, of ideas, of positions, will be very important, I think, to understand how the biennial was built. And several aspects of the project are like that. I think even more than what you see, the way the whole thing is structured and constructed is meaningful and is important for us.
So it's I think driving us at this idea of polyphony of voices and perspectives, but also I think contained in that is the idea of intimacy, right? And the drive that I see in your model of working to break down the mega exhibition model, to make it more to kind of break it down into smaller pieces and make it more intimate. And we see this not only in the example of the letter, but also I think in the way that you are working with 20 or 25 local partners across the city, so that you have a kind of conduit to an audience that is actually closer to the ground, closer to that audience.
Yes, exactly. So this relates to the idea first of the audience that you were talking about before. Who are these audiences? When you look at the audience of the biennial as a whole, it's very difficult to describe what that audience is. So in a way, having this one-to-one conversation with each of those institutions is a way of understanding much better what the audience of the biennial is, because at least potentially the audience of the biennial is the sum of all those different audiences. And at the beginning, when we started the project, we were sort of concerned about the amount of work that this represents, talk with so many institutions. But I have to say that was one of the best part until now. Of course, it's a lot of work, but it was also one of the most rewarding aspects of it, because you really see how each of those institutions, especially I would say those that are not really working with contemporary art on a permanent basis, they really have a very clear idea of what they want. They really know their audience very well. So like the example that I gave before, Tiradentes, which is this very I wouldn't say far away, because far away is obviously very relative. No, it's far away from me, but I'm far away from them. So, but let's say outside of the contemporary art scene, cultural institution, but that has a huge importance for the community as a whole, and it's a very large community. We went there, let's say at the beginning, the first time. We've been there a few times, but we went there the first time with this very naive idea of wanting to bring there the most important artist of the biennial, But then when you start this discussion, you realize that you don't know, I don't know who is the most important artist of the biennial, like to have, Picasso is not in the show, but to give an example, probably to bring Picasso there from a very naive point of view would be the grand gesture of saying, no, I really want the most important part to be here. But then in the conversation with them, they made it very clear that they were not interested in Picasso at all. They were interested in somebody who went there and did workshops with them, worked with them, gave them the visibility that they think they deserve. And they're very, very clear about that. I mean, they have no, how can you say, excess of respect for an institution like the Biennale. They really don't care. They know exactly how important they are and how what they do is important and relevant, and they want this to be shown in their cultural center and in the Biennale, but they think that it could be very interesting to collaborate with an international artist who comes and works with them. So in a way, this was like a huge lesson that I personally learned. This is the kind of artwork that from a conventional point of view of what art is would be a very cutting edge thing. And you would think that a non-prepared audience, an audience which is not used to see contemporary art, wouldn't react to this one, but they would react to, I don't know, a landscape painting. And they showed us immediately that it is absolutely not like that. So I think, again, this is just an example, but in all these approaches that we did, we're learning a lot. And this is like the best thing that can possibly happen.
Another somewhat logistical question that I have is how it seems it's any biennial is a huge amount of work, but then one that has also 25 collaborations with local partners, endless collaborations with international partners and artists. How is it going? Is my first question. But
no,
also,
it's going well.
Just sort of the follow-up question will be, do you think that you would have been able to do this if you hadn't been working with the biennial team in the early 2000s for 8 years as you did?
Well, I think I probably would, but I think I probably wouldn't have proposed this, because this, for me, the project that we're doing reflects a lot the way I think or the way I grew, into what the Biennale is. I always thought that the most fascinating aspect of it is this diversity of the audience and the fact that it needs to be really done for the city in a way that doesn't mean that if you come from abroad, you're not going to understand it, especially because who comes from abroad is a specialized audience that is able to understand what we're doing. But the only way to really see it all, or at least a good part of it, is if you're from there. If you live there, if you see what happens before, and if you're able to then see at least most of the exhibitions around. So it's really a biennial that is taught for the local audience. Now, on the part of the question of how we're doing, I think we're doing good. I think it's a lot of work, but I personally think, and I've been involved in other biennials, any biennial is beyond human limits anyway. So once you do it, you might as well do a project that you really believe in. Gabriel, who is the curator of the previous Biennale, is here, and he can tell how, with a completely different project, he was probably totally overwhelmed by it exactly the same way. I think there is a level of work and of stress which is directly proportional to the kind of project that you do, and maybe in this sense our project is broader. But then there is a lot of things that are just inherent to the scale of this project, you know, of a biennial project. And this is a lot of things that are completely beyond control anyway. So I think, I don't know if it might look as a very large project, but I don't know if the amount of work that we have is so dramatically more than other ones. Also because, again, we don't curate all the exhibitions in the institution. So that part, to some extent, is already done. It was more of a discussion, a conversation, getting to define the artists, because also this is one important aspect. Some of the artists were already in the program of those institutions, and we were lucky enough to have connections that made sense for both of us. But most of them are artists that we suggested. So often we suggested the artist, we suggested a curator who we knew was able to do this exhibition in that specific place. So, but that was largely or mostly done in the second semester of last year. So now we're really moving or focusing much more on the exhibition in the Biennale at this point.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about the kind of context within which you're curating this biennial. You've talked about your thinking being driven by reflections on the times we live in, obviously, and the title is obviously a reference to the kind of dark context that has that is ours, not just in Brazil but also here and in many different places around the world. Can you describe it for us in some specificity? Can you be Can I ask you to be somewhat of a witness for us and talk a little bit more about the context in which you're working and the darkness that you're describing?
Well, the context is a very dramatic one from the point of view of the government that we have right now. So this is like, you could say that there are very different shades of darkness. One is the government, which is something that is very recent and very dramatic, if you want. But if you expand it a little bit more, and we're trying to expand it a little bit more, is a darkness that also, if you look at it, for instance, from the perspective of the indigenous people in Brazil, and this is something that Viveiros de Castro has been very clear about, they've been living in this very same darkness for the last 500 years. So it's very, I don't know how to describe it actually, what is the right word, is very tragic, but it's very poetic maybe, I don't know, but it's very telling for sure that we work with artists. It's going to be around 90 artists, and I think it's going to be around 40 artists from 45 countries. And I would say that with hardly any exception, when we have the first conversation with the artists and we tell them what the title is, everybody understands right away what we're talking about. And of course they know about the Brazilian situation, but most of them, they immediately refer to their own situation. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it, in Italian we say mal comune mezzo gaudio, which is, if we're all if we all have problem, we're all a little bit happy. So from one point of view, you can look at it this way. From another one, you say, this darkness is everywhere, and it's really dramatic. And now, one thing that I think it's very important, and it's probably very specific to the Brazilian scene, or to the way the cultural scene is reacting to what we have right now, is, and this is also not new, it's what usually happens, is that you're led from whatever happens around you to think that the only thing that you should do is react to what the government is doing or to what is going wrong, let's say, and react in a very direct way. And in that sense, the biennial should only talk about that. This goes back to Brecht singing only about the dark times, or singing and that's it in dark times. And I believe, and this is really something that I'm very passionate about, that at this time, to do a biennial is to be able, it demands that you're able to also talk about other things. Because I believe if you only talk about that, then you lost already. And I believe we lost already, especially because this huge sphere of cultural, philosophical, poetical concerns is a sphere of interest which is ours, let's say. The other side, the one we're fighting against, doesn't have this one. So if you only fight on that terrain, is because you already lost your ones. And so this is something that is, for me, is very important. And I believe, again, when you think about the diversity of audience that comes to the biennial and the huge amount of people that come to the biennial, I think the biennial is an exhibition that really is meaningful. So when I was appointed, several people in Brazil and in other places told me, but what a hard time to do a biennial, what a difficult time. You know, of course, it is a difficult time. But on the other hand, I also think that there cannot be a better time than this one. If you really believe that what you're doing is meaningful and is important, then it should be done in the time where this can really affect people and make a difference in the people's life. And I think a biennial, different from most exhibitions, not just in Brazil, really still has this power. There is a phrase which I like a lot by Agamben. He says that, I will misquote, of course, but he says that only because art has left the sphere of interest to become merely interesting, we welcome it so warmly. And I believe that the Biennale is one of the very, very, very few contemporary art events that is still clearly in the sphere of interest for Brazilian culture. And this is, the demonstration of this is not the exhibition itself, is what always happens at the Biennale. I'm sure that something is going to happen when we open the Biennale. And in the last biennial, it happened. The one before it happened. The one before. You know, things that are not art-related is just because it's an exhibition that occupies what Agamben calls the sphere of interest. So can there possibly be anything better than doing a biennial in a time like this? I think, you know, it's a huge challenge. You have to be aware of how you do it. You will be criticized, of course. Not everybody will agree with the way you do it. But, you know, I think it's also a very challenging moment to do something like this.
And thank you for taking that challenge. If there are questions, I think we can take some. I see a hand. Oh, if you just hold on 1 second, we'll give you a mic so that everybody can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was great. So talking about this challenge, I think this is more of a piggyback question to what you're already discussing is, with any curatorial project, normally you come across hiccups or a bump in the road. So on something that's so large scale and kind of taking up such a big part of the city's cultural affairs, what is a unique or interesting challenge that you've run into?
Well, there's like around 10 challenges every day, more or less. I think the most inspiring one is really this idea of dealing with different audiences. And the most dramatic one right now is a very, very practical one, and is the coronavirus, which, as you know, is affecting economy brutally and is affecting very strongly the value of Brazilian currency. So in the last 4 weeks, I think it devaluated in relation to the US 25%. So I was traveling, but I'm sure that when I get back, this is going to be something that we unfortunately really have to look into. This is like what is really keeping me from sleeping at night right now, is that because it was already very tough, let's say, in terms of budget, even though the budget is compared, again, to most institutions in Brazil is perfectly fine, and I'm not complaining about that, but all of a sudden, everything that are international costs become 25% more expensive. It's tough, yeah.
Other question? Jacopo, I wonder if you can confirm this. Someone told me that that attendance numbers in Brazil last year raised by 30% nationwide.
The what?
That attendance numbers to museums has
I think
increased?
it's slowly increasing, but steadily. I don't know. 30% sounds like
Sounded
a
like a
lot.
lot.
Yeah, but it also depends very often on if you look at specific exhibitions in specific venues. So I don't know if that's an overall number. It sounds like a lot to me, but it is a fact that some or most institutions have consistently increased the number of audience of visitors, because I would say also the quality and the stability, I would say, of the institutions really changed. Like, I've been in Brazil for about 20 years, and I would say in the last decade the quality of, like, the stability, let's say, of the institutions really changed a lot. And this is also something that to a certain extent we were considering when proposing this exhibition, because this project, let's say, the fact of collaborating with so different institutions is also a way of helping some and creating a relation with others. So trying to find also a way that the biennial can still be a key player in the scene, because when it was created at the beginning of the 50s, the scene was completely different, and it was really instrumental, I think, for the Brazilian scene as a whole to become what it is today. But then, of course, when you have one institution, which is the biennial, working in a context where you barely have others, so you had the Modern Art Museum, which was actually the institution that created the biennial, and you had the MASP, but basically that was it. That was one scenario, let's say. But now you have at least 10 or 12 institutions that have consistent programs, plus the independent ones, plus the more peripheral ones. So in that context, what can the biennial do? This was also one of the reasons why we suggested something where the biennial is beyond just being, let's say, a mediatic event, is also something that creates a connection that maybe is more or less in place, but is not visible, at least in the local scene.
There's two questions. We start with the question at the back, and then we'll get to you, sir.
Hi. Can you comment on the rise of private foundations and the role of the Uber collector, and in relation to what's going on in Brazil, especially with Inhotim?
Yeah, well, Inhotim is one of a kind. It's not like you really have so many places like that. And the private foundations is not something you really see a lot in Brazil. What you see is corporate spaces, like the spaces related to banks, like Banco do Brasil, which is the main public bank, let's say, or Itaú. They have spaces that works. The Moreira Salles, which is a wealthy and very culturally advanced family, which was related also to Banco Itaú, has their own cultural center. So this is something that you see, but you don't see very much like you see in the States, for instance, collectors who go to the next level and open a foundation. This really doesn't really happen. What you see sometimes is collectors who open a space where their friends or people who know about it can go and see the collection, but there's quite a difference in that sense. So foundations don't really, I would say they're not important players in the scene, also because you often have foundations that are called foundations but they don't really have funds, like it's not like here the culture of the endowment is not so present. This is something that the MASP, the Museum of Art of São Paulo, is trying to introduce, and they're really struggling. And there has been for a long time now a talk about creating a law that sort of makes an incentive for endowment to be done, really donate to a museum and create a core of money from where you can build on. But in general terms, this doesn't exist. So it's really not such an important player of the scene as in other places. And then Inhotim is a very specific history, because it started with Bernardo Paz with his own collection. Then it became very big, and then he had all the legal problems that it just got out of, apparently. But it was really a strange way of dealing with the whole thing, because it was this incredibly beautiful place in the middle of nowhere, and the ecology part is just as important as the artistic part. But then it became so big that I think it was actually impossible to manage, so the public fund were used extensively. And one thing that is very I mean, we're now getting very specific, but since I guess you're interested, one thing that is very instrumental to the functioning of the Brazilian system, and actually the biennial is an institution that relies less than others on that, is it's a specific law that exists which allows cultural institutions to do fundraising with money which is tax deductible. So in the end, 95% of the fundraising which is done in Brazil is basically public money, indirectly. So it's money that would go to taxes, is not paid as taxes, and goes directly to the institution. So it's not exactly your question, but to some extent it's a very important aspect of how the system functions. And it's very important, I think, to say that even nowadays, which this government that I think is clear I'm not totally in favor of, but this system is still totally in place, and until now at least it hasn't been touched. And I say that because for Bolsonaro, before being elected, this law became one of the enemies that he was always fighting against, or saying that he wouldn't support, because of course the cultural scene as a whole is against this government. So he wanted to make it very clear that he was against them as well. But then when he got into power, he basically changed the name of the law, but the law is still there and nothing really changed in that sense.
We had another question. Yeah.
Well,
I think it's working.
I appreciate seems like a very honest and involved presentation. But I have some critical points to mention. I think maybe because addressed to the ICA, the independent curators, it seems like a presentation that is more addressed to a curatorial audience than to artists and to general public.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because I don't see any new ideas in terms of the curatorial aspect of your plan, in terms like they created a group of curators from different perspectives to disseminate the exhibition in different parts of the city, to have an involvement with the graphic part and the editorial publishing part. I think it's recurrent things. Mm-hmm. And I think what I feel like the presentation was talking more about the urban planning as a metaphor of the Biennale than the architecture. What is exactly the points and ideas, what it could be the addition of the architecture, and talking metaphorically. Mm-hmm. And that I need to address about the works of art. I think the works are, and I am talking about artists, I take works of art, because I think the problem sometimes the Biennale is a list of artists, when I think that the more important is to, what is the works? What is the selection of the work of these artists? Because a list of artists, I think, start to be recurrent in most of the biennales. Like that, maybe I hear more about the bones than the meat. Like that, I wanted just to, I probably will see in Sao Paulo in a week, but maybe we have more occasion to talk about.
Yeah. Well, okay. I don't have the ambition to be one who invents anything. This is what you're saying. I never say we're revolutionizing the curating or doing biennials. I do agree that most biennials have a list of artists. I think rarely I've seen a biennial without a list of artists. But I think that what I was invited to do here is to present the project. So yes, the master plan, not the bones. I would say I'm talking about the animal. I'm not even talking about the meat or the bones. I'm talking about the way the whole thing has been structured and how things are being layered one on top of the other. And the idea here is not to talk about the artist, because what we're doing here, or we're trying to do, is to create the condition for the artworks. And I do agree completely that it's about the artworks. I said that a few times. The artworks to breathe and to be seen in an intimate way, in a specific way, with relations that are suggested by us, but they are also not imposed by us. So I don't think we're inventing anything, but I also don't agree that everything that we're doing has been done before. I mean, this kind of relation with the institutions is not about expanding and occupying more space. It's about looking at the works of the artists in different ways. I don't recall a biennial doing that. I might be mistaken, but I don't. What I do recall is institutions working in that sense. If you ask me about, the institutions that we're collaborating with on an international level, for instance, one of them is the CCA Wattis. The CCA Wattis does this every year. They choose an artist that they have in their mind, and then they do things that resonate with that. So this is more or less what we're trying to do. We're trying to put things, the artworks, in a context where they can resonate in different ways. Maybe it's been done before. I'm sure it has, but I was just presenting what we're doing. I'm not saying we're, inventing the wheels or anything.
And I'll just add from ICI's perspective that we did invite Jacopo to speak about the project as it is in formation. And it is a reflections, or a series of reflections on a project in progress. Which is quite vulnerable a position to put a curator in some ways, because he doesn't have the luxury of hindsight and of being able to show us the work in the space. What this is, in some sense, is an opportunity for us to get clearer ideas of what his concepts are, and in fact, yes, the kind of bones that he's putting together to grow strong muscles in some ways. So I just wanted to add that. Serena, did you want to?
I wanted to make a comment. It's not a question.
We'll just give you a mic, Serena, if you just hold on 1 second. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment, since somebody asked about Inyoqing. ICI did a curatorial intensive at Inyoqing in 2012, which I think was amazing, because many alumni from that curatorial intensive are very involved in the art curatorial scene in Brazil now, and in other countries also. Mm. And the other thing is that the idea for Bernardo Paz to create Inyoqing as a place where he builds a pavilion for a specific installation by an artist was given to him by an artist, Dunga. Dunga sort of said to Bernardo Paz, don't just create another space for regular works of art. Make something really special and different. Yeah. And I thought that would be interesting for everyone to know.
Thank you, Serena. We have one more question, I think. Young-hee?
Thank you. Okay, so my question is for general public, not for the curators. And when we went to Venice Biennale, one of the most interesting presentations was by the Brazilian Pavilion. Would we be able to see the swingueiras in real life if we came to São Paulo? So that's question one. So obviously Brazil is a large country, very diverse. And in this Biennale, you talked about the darkness. And I'm wondering how much of a participation the indigenous artists will have, whether you have a specific focus on that. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, the swingueira in real life, I'm afraid not, because they're also not from São Paulo, they're from the north. And as far as indigenous artists are concerned, yes, we'll have a few artists participating, but it's not like they're going to be addressed as indigenous artists. They're contemporary artists who are indigenous, and they do work starting from their perspective and talking about specific issues and looking also at issues that are not specific in a very particular way. So they will not be presented as indigenous artists, but there are a few, and actually one of the artists that we think is more interesting in this very complex idea of what is an indigenous artist nowadays is Jacopo Crivelli, who is an artist from Roraima, and he will be one of the artists who has also an exhibition in an institution, not by accident, but because we think it's very relevant. And it's the exhibition that will happen right next door, so at the Modern Art Museum. So in a way, it's a very strong issue for us in the biennial, for sure.
So we have time for one more question. And I know there's we'll try this, I think this hand came up first. And depending on how quick the answer is, we might get to the one last question.
Hi. I'm wondering if you already have definitions on the contentions in architecture, if what will be shown in there will be based on themes or areas specific like indigenous, or is there any idea on how those squares will work?
It's, as I said, there are a few themes like circulation or repetition, so the ones that I mentioned, the statements, let's say, but there are other themes, and the idea is that these themes don't overlap exactly with the enclosed space, so one can start and continue. You sort of go from one to the other without really understanding when one stops and the other begins, because this is more, as I said before, more of a reverberating ideas that are sort of mixing one with the other. And one thing that I think will be very important, and we're working with the architects now on that, is how we modulate the rhythm inside each of those spaces, which also reflect or depends a lot on these materials that we're using to enclose them, as I said. So the ones that I show, it's opaque, but lets the light fall through. The other one is like a textile, which is very thin, so it's even more transparent, but it sort of creates an intimate space. And then in some cases, there will probably be one inside of the other, so you have different transitions, let's say, from the very large building, scale of the building, and then to one which is a little bit more quiet, to one which is even more intimate. So the idea is to modulate that as much as possible. Also, as I said, to really create a rhythm, because the building is so big that otherwise it just becomes too much, to just not have poses or different rhythms.
I think we have time for one more, right? Okay.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation. I was wondering about the community that you were talking about, that remote community.
Yeah.
How did you work with them, and how specifically did they define the works that they would love to be participating in their location? And also, were these works limited to be the works of the artists from Brazil or from the outside? Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Hopefully no Picasso there, but
yes. No, it's it will be. We're working on that. We don't have the works yet, but it's a long process, in fact, and it's an Italian artist, Marinella Senatore. I think she's done something in New York recently, actually, and she's an artist who very often, if not always, starts with conversation and workshops and really exchange with the communities of the places where she go and works. So what happens there is that we went there, we started discussing, and in order to understand better what they wanted, let's say, and then we proposed the artist, and we only went ahead after seeing that this kind of artist, the kind of work that she does, would make sense for the cultural center and for the community around it. So what is happening is that she will come 2 times. She will come soon, and then she will come back probably like 1.5 months before the opening. And she will, what she usually does is she get in touch with organizations that are already in place in each venue, let's say, where she works. And this organization can be anything, like they can be cultural related, but also not, like any kind of association you can imagine. And then very often what she does is she starts by listening, let's say, to what they have to say. And then this is part of a project, an ongoing project, which is called School of Narrative Dance. And she creates, together with all these people, a choreography which is largely based on the stories that they tell her. So in a way, their background, their histories, their past becomes part of a very large and very often cathartic performance that happens with all these people. They're performing the choreography that they contributed to create, in a way. So this is the idea, is that this is the project that we do. Of course, in each place is different. And then during all these workshops, she usually creates drawings, collage, objects, banners, flags, and part of this will be shown in the cultural center there, and part of it will be shown in the Biennale, so in both places.
Jacopo, thank you. Really good to have all those insights into the Biennale to come. And
thank you.
So if we go to São Paulo now, we see some of it, and
yes.
If we go in September, we see all of it.
Exactly.
And the opening is September.
September 5th is the first day for the audience, for the public.
There we go. So Labor Day weekend in São Paulo, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Good. Thank you.
No, thanks.